Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today we welcome author and historian Dr Sylvia Martin, who has published widely. Our conversation will be about her award-winning biography, Ida Leeson, A Life, Not a Blue Stocking Lady. Sylvia has written widely about feminist history and the neglected women in Australian history. In 1932, Ida Leeson became the first female librarian at Mitchell Library amidst a male-dominated climate. Tying in with the podcast today, I would like to mention the large LGBTQI collection at Inner West Libraries, and the podcast today is reflective of this collection. We have also named one of our balconies at Marrickville Library after Ida. Welcome, Sylvia.
Hello, Liesl. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So, what inspired you in writing the biography of Ida Leeson, A Life?
Well, actually, a librarian inspired me. I was at a launch of my first book, Passionate Friends, which was about an Australian poet called Mary Fullerton and her long-term relationship with a woman called Mabel Singleton and her friendship with Miles Franklin. And I was at the launch of this book, and afterwards this librarian came up to me and said, "I think you should write about Ida Leeson." And the name was familiar to me, and I went back and I found that Miles Franklin knew her really well, and she talked about her in her diary and in her letters. So I had a little bit of an introduction, and she sounded absolutely fascinating the more I looked into it. And I was fortunate enough to get the C.H. Curry Fellowship at the Mitchell Library to do my research on it.
That sounds fantastic. So when I was reading your book, I found the expression the blue stocking lady quite interesting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The blue stocking lady was a disparaging comment that was made by the former public librarian John Metcalfe, who actually didn't get the Mitchell librarianship when Ida Leeson did, but he was promoted above her. So that's a long story, but anyway, I think it was in the 80s he was retired, and he made this comment about the early lady librarians, as he called them, and he said they were women who had a university degree but weren't likely to get married. And he was really referring to women like Margaret Windeyer and Maud Fitzharding, who were early librarians, who came from a very upper class families. Margaret Windeyer's father was a Supreme Court judge, and Maud came from a very well-known legal family. But Ida Leeson couldn't have been further from that description, so that's why I called her not a blue stocking lady. Because she was born in Leichhardt, and Leichhardt, when she was born in 1885, was a very working class suburb. It was known as Struggle Town. Her father was a carpenter, and in the 1890s depression, he went to Western Australia to find work and never came back. Her mother was a seamstress, so she brought up the children. There was no way that Ida was going to get to university except under her own steam, so she got a scholarship to Sydney Girls High School, and then she got a scholarship to Sydney University, and she was one of the early women graduates really in 1906. She did a BA in History Honours and started at the public library in 1906, just after she graduated when she was 21.
That's really, really fascinating, Sylvia. So how would you describe Ida? Because, apparently she was extraordinary.
Yes, she was extraordinary. She was extraordinary in many ways. I mean, she was extraordinary because of her appearance. She was a very small woman, and there's a picture of her on the front of my book, actually, and she's sort of striding across the front of the page. She always wore a suit, a dark suit, but with a skirt and a collar and tie. And she always wore a hat, and she wore sort of a pork pie hat. And in summer she might have worn a linen suit with a straw hat, and then she wore very sensible lace-up shoes and lisle stockings. So she was quite unusual to look at to start off with, and she was also extraordinary because she lived with her partner Florence Birch for they were together for 50 years. And she was extraordinary in her work because she was, which was certainly what we'd call today a workaholic. She was an absolutely dedicated researcher. She, on her long service leave, even when she was away on holidays in London, she found the missing Matthew Flinders log in the Public Record Office in 1927, and she made other amazing discoveries. And yes, we'd certainly call her a workaholic.
So the Matthew Flinders log is also very interesting because I actually come from Mauritius, and I do
Yes.
know the story of Matthew Flinders being imprisoned on the island. So I was quite fascinated reading that part. So in terms of Ida, she was very much instrumental in developing the collection and exhibitions at Mitchell Library.
Yes.
Why was that? Was that due to her passion or her initiative? What else can you tell me about that?
Well, I think it was her passion and her initiative. She was an amazing. She first started off in the Mitchell Library after she transferred from the public library when the Mitchell Library was started as a cataloguer. She learnt cataloguing from the poet Christopher Brennan, who also worked there. Um, and cataloguing in those days was a pretty difficult subject. It required a lot of research. It required her working in other languages. So she was a brilliant woman, and she was just dedicated to her work there.
So I know that from your book, Ida was friendly with many people, but also she was quite stern with others. But I do remember her being very friendly with prominent people such as Miles Franklin and the Griffins. What
Yes,
really
that's right.
attracted what attracted them to her?
Well, Miles Franklin was one of the writers of the time, and she used to go into Mitchell nearly every day, several days a week. She'd go in on the train from where she lived and come in and work in the Mitchell. And a lot of writers did. I mean, we mightn't realise today that the Mitchell Library was actually the hub of literary activity and intellectual activity in Sydney at the time, that you couldn't just go to a bookshop and buy a book. And Mitchell Library got all the new Australian books. So a lot of the writers used to actually go in to do their research, but also to read the latest writings. So many writers collected in the library, and Miles became friendly with Ida and used to bring her flowers from her garden. She'd have zinnias on her desk, and Ida also helped in proofreading. For instance, she proofread the woman I wrote my PhD on, Mary Fullerton. She proofread a book of her poems that Miles was getting published. So there was a lot of interaction
Yeah.
in the library.
I think a very social person as well. I believe that she was very much involved in the theatrical productions that the Griffins put together.
Yes, she was. The Griffins and Ida are together because of, well, they come together because of Florence, really. Florence Birch, Ida's partner, was a theosophist. Well, she was actually an anthroposophist, which was the breakaway movement from theosophy. And so were Mary and Marnie Griffin and Walter Burley Griffin. And Ida and Florence rented a house in Castle Crag, the suburb that the Griffins started as sort of the ideal suburb, and they lived in a Griffin house there. So that's how they came to know the Griffins. He became very friendly with them. What was the rest of your question? I missed that.
So I think she was involved very much in doing the lighting for the productions that the Griffins put together.
Oh yes, she
Yeah.
was. She was. Yeah, there was it was an amphitheatre in Castle Crag, and Mary and Marnie Griffin used to put on plays there, and Florence was involved in them. And Ida was not a thespian, but there's a wonderful photo of her that's in the Waverley Library, and it's reproduced in my book, of Ida sitting in the audience, and she's all rugged up in a winter coat and a hat. And she's holding a car headlamp at the stage to light the stage for one of the productions.
Extremely eccentric lady. So you've mentioned a little bit about Florence Birch already. Could you expand more about the relationship between the two women and also how controversial that was for the time?
Well, it was controversial for the time, except that Ida just went through her life. Florence was involved in everything she did. Everybody knew about her at the library. She used to bring her to functions. Florence was always there. And I don't know that Ida ever mentioned the word lesbian. but they were an accepted couple, and they were an open couple,
Mm-hmm.
which may have had something to do with the fact that it was very hard for Ida to get the Mitchell librarian position, although she was the most qualified for it in 1932. The word was that it was because she was a woman and that that position could never go to a woman, but I suspect that it had a bit to do with the fact that she was a lesbian as well. But anyway, to get back to where she met Florence, I found it really hard to find out where they met. There was nothing, nobody knew that. Nobody remembered where they met, and I discovered that Florence worked for the YWCA in Sydney, and she was a New Zealander, but she came and she worked in Sydney for the YWCA, and I looked through their records, and in about 1910, Florence had a literary circle at the YWCA, and Ida's name is there, so I suspect that's where they met. So they kind of met at a former version of a book club, really, in about 1910. And then Florence went back to New Zealand in 1912 because she got a very senior job with the YWCA there, and she opened a whole lot of different branches in New Zealand. But she used to come back every year and stay with Ida, and then she actually retired. She was really exhausted in 1923, so that's quite a long time after they met. But then they moved in together for the first time, and they first of all lived in a flat in Stanley Street, just near the library, and then they moved to Castle Crag in 1930 and lived there for 3 years, and the rest of their lives they lived in a flat in Kirribilli, and they were together until Florence died in 1957.
So, as I mentioned before, obviously that was very controversial for the times, but it seems that the relationship was very strongly, well, very strong and had a strong foundation.
After Florence died, a friend of theirs told me that when she met Ida just after Florence had died, she said Ida was pale yellow in colour, and she asked her how she was feeling, and she said, "I'm bleeding inside." So I found that incredibly touching and moving,
Yeah, and very
that Ida
sad
said
too.
that about her partner that she'd been with for 50 years.
Yeah, very sad as well.
Yeah.
So, Sylvia, there's been a lot of speculation about Ida's bloomers.
Ah,
Can you talk about this?
I can. I've devoted a whole chapter at the end of the book to call it the spinster's bloomers, about Ida's bloomers, because it kept coming up whenever I interviewed anybody. This bloomers story would come up, and I thought, this is so weird. And I found out that it originates with the historian Manning Clark, who was in fact very friendly with Ida and Florence, but he used to circulate this story about Ida's bloomers, and he says that when Ida was the Mitchell librarian, because she always wore a skirt, she didn't wear slacks, but she would go up a ladder to get books, and the readers would ask her to go up to the ladder because every day she had bloomers down to her knees, and they would have a different coloured bow on them, so the readers would. It's a complete myth. It never happened. Florence was the one who had bows and not Ida, and also Ida didn't go up. There was no ladder in the Mitchell Library. Where the Mitchell Library was then is now a reader's room, and the main Mitchell Library was the public library. And so the old Mitchell Library didn't have ladders to the shelves. The young readers didn't read in there. They were mainly well-established researchers who read in there, and Ida wouldn't have been climbing ladders to fetch books for them. So I don't know where the story comes from, but anyway, Manning Clark perpetuated it and told it everywhere, and it's a story that's lived on.
How
And
strange.
well, I sort of think that Ida was a woman that men couldn't quite cope with.
Mm.
They couldn't, she was such an unusual woman, and although it's about bloomers, but she was a middle-aged woman when he met her, and so it's sort of not sexual, but it's slightly prurient. I think it's a very, very weird story, and I do try to tease it out in the book.
Very strange.
Yeah.
So, working in a library, I would like to ask you what you're reading or watching and listening at the moment.
Oh, well, I've just read a wonderful biography by Kathy Perkins, who actually works at the State Library, about Zora Cross, who was a writer who is now totally unknown, but who published a book of love poetry in 1917, which was pretty unusual for the time. And nobody knows about her, or nobody knows about her much these days. I do, but that's because I've happened to worked on Miles Franklin and her contemporaries. But Kathy found this book in the State Library and became fascinated by her life, and it's a really wonderful biography, so I would recommend that. What else
Fantastic.
have I been reading? I've just finished Rebecca Mackay's book, The Great Believers. She's a US writer, and it's about the AIDS era in Chicago in the 1980s. So it's sort of very moving, and to be reading about a pandemic that's earlier than this one.
Yes,
And it's a fascinating book.
interesting. So I believe that you have a new book out this year. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, yes, I do. It's a book called Sky Swimming, and it's the subtitle is Reflections on Auto/Biography, People and Place. And in this, I've sort of turned what has been my biographer's lens onto myself. And somebody said to me when they read a couple of the essays, you're really writing a biography of your life rather than any sort of confessional autobiography. So I quite like that description. And it's a series of memoir essays. So it's about my family, it's about my relationship with my partner of over 30 years, and we built a mud brick house together in the 1980s, which was fairly unusual for two women. Um, um, and so it also talked quite a bit about writing biography, so my subjects of my biographies do crop up in the book, including Ida Leeson. And the book was published by my wonderful publisher, sorry, Terry Ann White of University of Western Australian Publishing, and she published it. It came out in February this year. She also published my last biography, which was about Eileen Palmer, who was a poet and an activist, and she published that book too.
I look forward to reading your new book, Sylvia. I think we've come to a close, so thank you so much for your time today, Sylvia.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in, and look out for our upcoming podcast on our Inner West Council website, on the What's On, and our social media channels. Thank you so much, Sylvia.
Thanks, Lizelle.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.